I'm going to now introduce Professor Mohan Dutta. Dr. Mohan is a media expert, author, and academic. He's the Dean's Chair Professor of Communication and Director of the Center of Culture-Centered Approach to Research and Evaluation at Massey University in New Zealand. He is going to be talking about the importance of voices from the Global South in communication research. Dr. Mohan, over to you.
Salam and kia ora. Thank you so much for inviting me to join you in this conversation. What I thought I would do is present to you some of my thoughts about what does it mean to build communication theory that is grounded in the voices of the Global South, and particularly attend to the South Asian registers, which I think are really relevant in terms of how we decolonize communication. So the way I thought I will set up this conversation is by first and foremost exploring the contemporary context within which we theorize communication and look at hegemonic approaches to communication studies. And I will argue that these approaches have foregrounded Western imperial constructions of communication and therefore exist in continuity with colonial processes that systematically construct the Global South as a backward space that is lacking, that is in deficit, and therefore incapable of producing communication theory. So to uphold the voices of the Global South calls for us to explore the ways in which communication inequality in the distribution of communicative resources shapes what knowledge forms are foregrounded as acceptable knowledge forms and what knowledge forms are simultaneously erased or backgrounded. So in that context, then, I want to wrap up this conversation by looking at this concept of voice infrastructures. I will define what I mean by voice infrastructures and really ask this question: what does it mean then for Global South scholars to build voice infrastructures? And I would love to hear from you, what does it mean for scholars in Pakistan, for communication practitioners in Pakistan to build these voice infrastructures through which you can make knowledge claims in the registers of the Global North. So I want to begin by looking a little bit in the history of communication studies and the birth of communication studies. Now, communication studies as a discipline historically, at least in its modern form, is very much a product of US imperial and Cold War interests. So here in this image, you see the US flag flying over the spaces of the Middle East that have historically been configured within the logics of Cold War politics at sites of interventions. That is just one example. But across post-colonial nations of the Global South, as they emerged through anti-colonial struggles and secured their freedoms, the US imperial interests became critical in foregrounding particular strategies of communication in order to co-opt these anti-colonial struggles to serve US geostrategic interests and US interests in the promotion of free market capitalism. So we have to look at the history of communication studies precisely within that context in which it emerged, particularly in research and teaching of communication as persuasion, communication as the promotion of democracy. Now, the idea of democracy promotion in this sense connected to the theorizing of communication has been fundamentally Western, has been fundamentally imperial in its constructions of democracy, while simultaneously actually working to systematically undermine people's democratic movements across the Global South. So to serve the US geostrategic interests and the interests of the free market, communication has been constructed precisely as propaganda, often propping up repressive state and military structures that have subverted redistributive politics, and anti-colonial struggles. So I really want to begin by this point that there is a fundamental hypocrisy in terms of how we think of communication studies and its configuration, particularly in terms of the way in which it articulates itself in relationship to democracy, and then the actual practices of communication studies in foregrounding authoritarian interests that have systematically subverted the voices of people and voices of communities across the global south. So within this context then, one of the aspects we see in terms of the hegemonic infrastructure of communication, particularly communication as imagined in the Western sense and its ideas of democracy, is the concept of communicative inequality. Now, this is an image of the violence that we are witnessing at this moment in Gaza. And one of the things that we often talk about in Global South registers is, what we might call as the hypocrisy of the Western imperial apparatus in terms of its rhetoric of the rules-based order, its rhetoric of upholding an international justice-based order, and yet at the same time fundamentally propping up forms of violence that break, discard all forms of rules. So we see this in the bald-faced hypocrisy through which Israel, for instance, in the contemporary context, is carrying out its genocide in Palestine and fundamentally defying international laws and international norms, and doing so through the support of the US, the upholder of democracy. Now, for a lot of South Asian scholars, when we try to theorize this, we talk about this as a paradox or a form of hypocrisy. But, I make the argument that we need to look beyond that to actually say that the constructions of notions of liberty, democracy, freedom, justice within Western contexts have been precisely worked out in the production of the other. So people of the global south have continually been produced as the other, as incapable of democracy, and therefore our voices have historically been erased in order to prop up knowledge systems of the North or the West. So this communicative inequality is at the crux of the inequalities we see in epistemology and ontology, or what might be called epistemic injustice, which is the limited opportunities or the absence of opportunities for people, communities, intellectuals, poets, authors, artists of the global south to create discursive registers that matter within the context of global geopolitics. So one of the refrains we continually see in the context of Gaza, for instance, is to say that how many children need to be dead before they are counted as children. But the ontology of global knowledge production systems works such that children of Gaza as the other are not human or less than human as the other, and therefore do not count as children. So this production of communicative inequality is fundamentally based upon a process of othering that produces the other, and as other then, the other does not count. So you think, for instance, of what we talk about as the Palestine exception in the contemporary context, where notions of justice, notions of human rights stop at the Palestine question. And if you look at the workings of that, what lies at the crux of that is the production of the Palestinian body as the terror, or as the source of terror, or as the terrorist. And this production of the Palestinian as a terrorist is at the core of this process of epistemic erasure and the production of communicative inequality. So we really have to look at the kinds of discourses and narratives that are at work to legitimize the forms of inequality in the distribution and ownership of information resources, resources for representation, decision making, voice and community participation, and participation in democracy. Now, there are intersectional drivers of these communicative inequalities, and in my work, I argue that there are three fundamental drivers we need to look at. Settler colonialism as a driver, so the kind of settler colonialism we are seeing with the ongoing Israeli occupation of Palestine, in Gaza, in the West Bank, and the continual production of discourse to carry out these forms of expulsion and displacement. At the same time, we have to look at the intersections of these forms of settler colonialism with imperialism, particularly in terms of US imperialism and contemporary forms of US imperialism that uphold this infrastructure. And then we have to look at the intersections of these with patriarchy, particularly in terms of the reproduction of misogynist practices around arms, around military, that legitimize the continual erasure of voices at those intersections. So voices of communities that are colonized, voices of women in those communities, voices of diverse genders within those communities. So communication then continues to perpetuate forms of colonialism that we witnessed historically with colonial apparatus like the British East India Company in new forms. So we have to think about how in global geopolitics, new or neo-colonialism then continues to perpetuate these same forms of inequities, particularly in the promotion of the free market as an architecture for extracting resources and producing these inequalities. In the ongoing perpetuation of the extractive agendas of capitalism, particularly in the perpetuation of platform capitalism, the ways in which global platforms are deployed to produce disinformation and hate, to continue to produce the colonial divide and rule strategies, where hate itself becomes an algorithmic infrastructure in magnifying the processes of othering. So you see, for instance, the extreme Islamophobia that is built into the architectures of global platforms such as X or Meta, and the ways in which these platforms then exaggerate these forms of hate. So in a significant cross-section of my work, looking at Islamophobic hate, for instance, I demonstrate the ways in which white supremacy, the ideology of Hindutva and the ideology of far-right Zionism works hand in hand to produce Islamophobic hate that is actually multiplied through platforms. This hate then serves as the legitimizing mechanism to reproduce mechanisms of surveillance, the ways in which communities are continually surveilled, and at the same time producing epistemicide, the erasure of the knowledge of these communities, which then is the basis for ongoing genocide and erasure. At the crux of this, I also want to draw attention to colonial divide and rule strategies, because colonialism has survived on divide and rule processes. So colonialism's deployment of divide and rule in terms of dividing up communities and then placing them in conflict with each other has shaped the ways in which contemporary geopolitics continues to produce disinformation, continues to target marginalized communities, and continues to benefit from the reproduction of hate. So in that sense, again, in my work, I talk about hate itself being a profitable commodity. So you see within the context of conflicts, the ways in which disinformation is continually produced, and the algorithms of digital infrastructures magnify these pieces of disinformation manifold, which then itself demonstrates the extent to which this form of hate itself becomes a mechanism for profiting. And you see this across global contexts. For instance, in the UK, with the targeting of immigrants, or in the US, with the targeting of migrant communities, the ways in which the othering discourses multiplied on digital platforms translates into brick and mortar kinds of strategies, but is also manipulated in political campaigns and shapes the political architecture. Now, in this context, I also want to argue that post-colonial societies historically have also benefited from these divide and rule processes, from the magnification of the hate, particularly in terms of the elites within these societies, or post-colonial elites benefiting from these processes of divide and rule, these processes of othering. So you see political parties, you see the military exaggerate and develop more infrastructures of power, consolidate more power as it continues to produce these messages of othering. So post-colonial contexts often uphold elite power and control by perpetuating colonial logic. So this is an invitation for us all in the global south to actually interrogate our own investments in perpetuating these colonial logics. Post-colonial contexts often erase voices from the margins of these post-colonial contexts. So you think about the ways in which the voices of women are erased, the ways in which the voices of working class communities are erased, the ways in which voices of diverse communities within these societies that are at the margins are often erased in order to serve the interests of the elite. So elite gatekeepers are invested in perpetuating colonial divide and rule strategies because they personally benefit and are able to extract wealth and capital from these processes of elite capture. So hegemonic communication structures then, and this is the point I want to wrap up with before moving into thinking through solutions. So hegemonic communication structures then work to reproduce imperialism. So I work in the Indian context, I would say casteism. In the Pakistani context, I invite you to think about what are the layers of elite capture and hierarchy that work, particularly in terms of the workings of patriarchy, the workings of caste, the workings of class politics, and how that intersects with racial capitalism and capitalist forms of extraction. And within the context of digital media, platforms, new tech, how that then works through platform ideology in terms of individualizing people, in terms of constructing them as linear agents, and at the same time multiplying manifold the processes that reduce them to individuals, and removing them simultaneously from connection, community, love, from possibilities of crafting peace, solidarity, and connection. So neoliberal digital structures, I want to sort of, in this final slide in my critical analysis, connect all this to the contemporary context of digital architectures as we talk about AI and platform technologies. It is really important to remember the ownership patterns of platform capital, where power is consolidated in the hands of few Western large tech corporations, where data capture and data colonialism are mechanisms for perpetuating the surveillance, but also profiting from the participation of people on these platforms. And at the same time, one of the things that concerns me is the ways in which the language of decolonization is co-opted within these structures to uphold, on one hand, the capitalist agendas, and on the other hand, to serve fairly fascist authoritarian purposes that continue to perpetuate repression, surveillance, and the ongoing marginalization of people. And Israel, again, is a great example of that in terms of the modalities of surveillance and data capture to perpetuate ongoing expulsion and displacement of people while placing them under surveillance. In fact, technologies such as Palantir that have deep Zionist linkages offer you examples in terms of the ways in which global tech works to capture and consolidate data to uphold the surveillance capital, which fundamentally should be of concern for any of us across the global south in terms of the ways in which our bodies, our participation are turned into data, and also the ways in which then our opportunities for authentic participation, authentic knowledge generation are fundamentally erased. So to what does it take then to transform these structures, and really the invitation that you offered me to think in terms of the voices of the global south? And here I want to offer the framework that I have been working with in my own research program, the culture-centered approach. And on the right on the screen, you see an image from the well of the Bandung conference. The Bandung conference to me is a powerful register when we think of the global south and the non-aligned movement that brought so many of us colonial nations that emerged in post-colonial contexts in this articulation of non-alignment as a fundamental principle of sovereignty, where global south nations came together to articulate a politics and a pathway outside of colonial divide and rule. Unfortunately, I think that we have regressed far away from that, but I think it's really important to remember what happened with Bandung and non-aligned movement, and particularly in the context of communication, the New World Information and Communication Order that emerged out of this movement and was a proposal into the UNESCO infrastructure, and it faced a lot of backlash, particularly from US imperial interests. And why was that? It's really important to think through that critically, but also to look back at that history and then to ask, what are the processes needed for the global south to come together, to build solidarity, to build connection, to reimagine Bandung in terms of reorganizing structures that challenge hegemony, that seek to dismantle structures by co-creating new structures based upon principles of cooperation, based upon principles of mutuality and mutual respect, based on principles of relationality, based upon the recognition of our shared histories, our sisterhoods, and our brotherhoods that fundamentally connect us. So decolonization as an anchoring of communication is an invitation to think beyond the processes of violence that are built into the colonial architecture. And it's an invitation to think back to our pasts, to think back to the histories of our pasts where our peoples have lived together with connections that deeply connect us in love, in harmony, in community, in struggles, in social movements and activist interventions, and everyday performances where we see the mutuality of each other and humanity of each other, rather than sort of the divide and rule strategies that have been placed upon us as almost a performative screen through which we are made to see each other. So in this context, the concept of voice infrastructures is really important. And I define voice infrastructures as systems, platforms, norms, and processes through which communities can express their voices, share their stories, and participate in decision-making processes. So if it is the sovereignty of communities that has fundamentally been erased, the concept of voice infrastructures invites us to think through how might we rebuild spaces for sovereignty where we can tell our own stories, where we can generate our own articulations of knowledge and participate in the world based upon these articulations of knowledge. So I want to give you some examples of these concepts of voice infrastructure and sovereignty. And the first concept is the notion of communicative sovereignty. And that refers to the capacities of the colonized and post-colonial people to control and own the communicative resources and narrate stories of colonial terror. So witnessing colonial terror becomes a way for communities to actually craft alternative stories. So in the context of Israel, one of the things that you see is the ways in which Western media are organized continually to carry out Israeli propaganda while simultaneously erasing Palestinian accounts. And in that context, one of the things that we see in the contemporary juncture is the way in which stories from Gaza have fundamentally disrupted that colonial erasure. So, I mean, here I have the example of the Palestinian journalist Bisan Ota, and you see similar examples of many journalists who offer us accounts of the colonial violence and the witnessing of it, and that becomes a basis for conceptualizing how we look at the media and infrastructures of the global South.
This is Bissam from Gaza. I am still alive. It's the day 467 of the genocide. It's 6 p.m. Gaza time now, and people here around me are waiting for the ceasefire announcement. I'm near Nasser Hospital in Khan Yunis. People here are displaced, hopeless, grieving, so tired, and just waiting for any announcement. You need to know before this that this is not the end of the genocide. This is not the end of the war. Israel's war against God.
So this is a great example of the ways in which voice infrastructures of the global South actually percolate through these very architectures that are built to erase, that are built to profit from erasures in order to disrupt those structures. This year's ICA theme is disrupting and consolidating communication research. And this is a great invitation for us to see how global South voice infrastructures can disrupt into the colonial imperial infrastructures. This process also calls for us to transform our habits of accountability. Usually we are trained, even as academics or communication practitioners, to be accountable to the hegemonic or dominant structures. So what does that mean in terms of a global South principle to shift our accountability to the communities at the margins, to the people at the margins, and to engage in dialogue with communities that are systematically erased from discursive spaces? And how do we then build communication architectures, systems of governance that work through accountability to voices of those at the margins of our communities? And then finally, I want to wrap up with this question of what does it mean for us to be rooted in collectivization, where outside of those individualizing logics of global capital and imperialism, we see ourselves in connection with each other as collectives. We are able to conceptualize notions of sovereignty within our ideas of collective habits and collective belonging, where we can articulate collective rights and at the same time disrupt this forms of authoritarian and fascist erasure that seem to profit from the ongoing division of people. And then recognizing that our bodies are continually placed under surveillance by infrastructures of platforms and new media, how can we decenter these practices of surveillance? I have on the, when you're facing the screen on your right-hand side, this image of a sapling growing from the roots. And this image invites us to think about what are the kinds of global South epistemologies that offer us the basis for decolonizing the architectures of the global North, that offers us ways for thinking beyond the individualism, the competitiveness, the reductionism in the knowledge systems of the North. I want to give you some examples from the work that my center CARE does within the context of listening to the voices of margins. So this is from our work with Maori, who are the indigenous people here of Aotearoa, New Zealand. And Maori think of their knowledge systems in relationship to land. So we talk about global South knowledge systems. In many indigenous knowledge systems, knowledge itself is rooted in land. So in this particular piece of work, we look at how voice infrastructures situate the connection between land and knowledge, and particularly then in the context of struggles of people of the land to retain their ownership and their sovereignty over the land. So I will just play this for you. So here, this idea that we reject the modern day confiscation of our land becomes a way for offering a decolonizing register into knowledge through voice. So this gives you a practical example of how voice works by being anchored in land struggles, but also anchored in notions of sovereignty. So the same community that you saw in the land occupation then grows food on that land, and through articulation of sovereignty over food, over ancestral land, it talks about replenishing the bodies, and through that process, replenishing the knowledge systems. And again, you see a lot of parallels of this with the struggle in Gaza in terms of the articulation of land as a source of food and growing food as a way for enacting sovereignty and sustenance. So I want to wrap up then by arguing that through voice, we can fundamentally reimagine democracies, we can reimagine digital spaces by being anchored in indigenous and global South knowledge systems, by being committed to foregrounding these knowledge systems and really asking what does it mean to build community and public pedagogies that uphold the knowledge systems of the global South. I look forward to listening to you now, particularly in terms of how you think about these concepts in the context of the work that you're doing, and particularly in terms of how you see the work of challenging ongoing Western imperial domination of communication theory and knowledge. Thank you.